All right, here we are. Thanks everyone for joining. My name is Ethan. I'm the Infrastructure and Development Caucus Chair of the Arlington Young Democrats. I have a background in city planning, so it's my pleasure to be speaking with Matt D. Ferranti tonight. He's an Arlington County Board member, and he's going to be talking to us about a comprehensive initiative from Arlington County discussing and focusing on the issue of missing middle housing. So just very briefly, missing middle housing refers to how a lot of the development throughout a city can either be single family homes or it can be high-rise apartments, and there's a large volume of different types of housing that may be missing, or if they're there, there's just not enough of them to provide the adequate supply of housing that we need. So Matt, thanks for joining us. Really excited to have you here.
Thanks very much, Ethan. Glad to be here. Really appreciate the chance. So sure. I will just talk for a few minutes, and then I want to get to your questions. I'm thrilled that we have you're hosting urban planning major and bringing that expertise. And I know so many YDs that I talk with have a real interest both personally in this, but also have studied really in this area. So we'll jump right to it and then get to questions. I've asked for the hook after 15 minutes so that we are sure to get time for all your questions. But I'll start with just acknowledging that two things, that this is an area where dear friend and former colleague Eric Gutschall really led in this area. And so I miss him. We miss him a whole lot. And I'm grateful to the YDs for being really considerate about this incredible loss and terrible loss for our community and the board. We all care about this issue, but it certainly was a loss. So we are also in just a very difficult time because of COVID-19. And I'll just say briefly that today the county board, there was a press conference, and the Arlington County Board has been advocating for a data-based approach to reopening. And so the governor has indicated that Northern Virginia as a region has different data that is applicable. And so we're hopeful that we will focus on health and really not open up until the data shows that we can. So that's COVID-19 in a nutshell. There's also a ton of resources available for renters. I know so many YDs, most but not all are renters, and we have, so that you know, there's evictions are not allowed through May 17th because the Virginia courts are closed. And there's also, we've invested hundreds of thousands of dollars already in Arlington Thrive, which helps people who are at risk of renters who are at risk of not being able to stay in their homes. So that aside, we'll go to missing middle. I have a PowerPoint. I will try not to get you to death by PowerPoint. We'll just start with this first one. Missing middle. This is adapted from a presentation that I gave to the Ballston did and a number of other places. The whole county board has been reaching out to have conversations like the one we're having tonight on missing middle. It's part of Housing Arlington, and one of the central reasons why I sought this office and seek to serve both so many of you and then Arlingtonians across the county. So our population is just north of actually 226,000. People want to live here. People love to live here. Both the corridors make transportation easy. That's how I got to work for the first 4 years that I lived here, and how so many Arlingtonians get to work. So we're going to keep growing, and as we keep growing, if we don't expand supply, we're going to be in a difficult spot. So that's part of why the missing middle housing study. This slide talks about, I think many YDs know that over 50% of Arlingtonians are renters, but that number at the left shows that 73% of land zoned in Arlington is exclusively for single-family detached homes. So that's a mismatch between where things, where the land is and where the people are. And so Arlington is becoming increasingly difficult to unaffordable for many people. And that's true of county employees, our police, our firefighters, our teachers. It's also true of many YDs and many of us, really. There's some barriers. Some of those barriers are economical, but some of those are about the amount of and the type of units that we have. And our land use and zoning policy really restrict that. There's a question about Euclidean zoning that we'll come back to on this question. So our neighborhoods are changing. Clarendon has changed a ton since I was in my 20s. It was significantly larger Vietnamese population and restaurants, and it has changed quite a bit. The trends show that new housing unit constructions is really either very, very large or very small. I live just south of the courthouse, and you can see there's some affordable units that are going up that are 249 units in one building. And it's great to have affordable units, but those units are actually only rental and they're not home ownership opportunities, which is a lot of missing middle. So our neighborhoods are changing. We have to continue to change to be a diverse and inclusive community, or we will struggle to do that. We can't stop regional growth, but we have to evolve. So some of you may know that in the 1970s, there was a huge debate about whether to have Metro go along I-66 or put it underneath Wilson Boulevard. And the leaders who were there on the county board showed vision in thinking about mixed-use development, which enables all of us to live and work right next to transportation. So that's made us a success. But Housing Arlington is seeking to address some of that success, supply, the types of available housing, and we know there's no single solution, but one of the answers really to the broader Housing Arlington challenge is missing middle. So this slide, slide 7 here, one of the questions that I was asked was about what type and volume of housing are we missing? So I think Ethan mentioned, it's really, the phrase missing middle could either, some people use it to mean a type of housing, and some people use it to mean missing middle income housing. This slide shows you the types of housing, and I like to use the phrase missing middle to talk about types of housing, because it's very difficult to, when you talk about missing middle income, that's a whole related but distinct concept. So we have all these types of housing. We just don't have it in the amounts that we would need. So duplexes, triplexes, courtyard apartments, bungalow courts, townhomes, we all have those. And multiplex and live-work type places, we have all of those. We just don't have them in the numbers that we need so that you could buy a part of a duplex like folks used to do. If you've ever been knocking doors down in Fairlington, there's a whole group of homes that social workers and teachers and new people working on the Hill, people working at nonprofits would buy, and they could afford them. But the prices even of those courtyard garden style apartments have gone up so much that we're really facing challenges. So all of those types of housing we're undersupplied in. We certainly have you could argue we have a lot as a percentage and perhaps an oversupply as a percentage of single family homes. We just have so many people demanding to live in Arlington, whereas my parents' generation wanted to move out to Burke and Lake Braddock and Loudoun. And now people want to live in single family homes or in anything they can afford to buy in Arlington. So that's a part of why we're conducting this study. These are examples I'm going to move pretty quickly through these. We need families have struggles living here and buying here, and each of these different types of missing middle housing types could really help people either stay and rent or more often stay and buy and continue to live in Arlington. The document on the left is the Affordable Housing Master Plan for those. That's actually 2015, and I was one of the people on that task force. There is a whole world out there of ways in which you can get involved in housing. There's the Tenant Landlord Commission. There's the Housing Commission. I think for YDs, you guys are so involved in changing the state of Virginia last year that, it's also important to be aware of the ways in which you can serve through a commission and start to take increasingly larger leadership roles as you do. So the Affordable Housing Master Plan, we will update that this year. It was written in 2020 after a huge effort from county board members, Mary Hines and others. So that's a key piece of things. These are the policies specific that talk about why we need missing middle study. This is the process that led to it. I'm just going to keep moving pretty quickly. Katie Crystal led a big series of big picture conversations. And then this past year, we had 3 Facebook Live town halls through the county that you can look up online if you just Google Housing Arlington. And the one on equity really was the largest attended. Those 4 questions, who benefits, who's burdened, who's missing, and how do you know, are ones that drive a lot of our thinking on the board now. This is the goals of the study. You really do have to go out. If you think about the debate, frankly, regarding Amazon, some opposed. Personally, I think that it was the right choice for Arlington. I also, on a federal level, believe that antitrust is a big challenge that we face. So these are some of the considerations as the study proceeds. This study as a whole basically says that the missing middle housing study won't fix all our problems, but it's a start. There's some phases, and if you look at the bottom, the timeline for these phases has kicked back 6 months. I will also, because of COVID-19 response. We have been taking steps to engage, but it's difficult to engage in quite the same way online. So these are a few different types, and these are some of the questions as we understand this. I'd like to just keep moving and get to your questions. I will send this slide deck to you so that all of you can look at it and evaluate it and ask me questions later. I'll provide my email as well. So these are the types of housing and where they should be located. Many of you on the call will have heard of what Minneapolis did with housing, with their analysis of housing. I think that there are actually some distinctions between Minneapolis. It's a much bigger land area than our 26 square miles. And what they did reflected a market that was depressed. They had a lot of units that, housing units that were foreclosed on. And we didn't have quite that same situation. There's different, I mentioned the top question here is on the economics. Remember, missing middle can be a housing type. It also refers to an income, missing middle income households, which we need to focus on. So we've talked a little bit, I've just touched on some of, there would need to be specific zoning ordinance changes in order for missing middle to move forward. So we have to really have this dialogue in forums like this, but also with exchanges back and forth over time to build a coalition for this. The top of this slide is what's key. It's community engagement. We have learned in Arlington that we really have to engage in order to have good policy and good conversations. So this is another slide that touches on the key, how important community engagement is, as does this one in a grid. And then there's information on this on Arlington VA, housingarlingtonva.us/missing middle that you can get to. there are questions. You see that email at the bottom. You can ask those questions, ask your questions there, and our staff will get back to you. So that's the end of this slide.
And those economic incentives and the political ramifications of that housing, of that type of zoning. So we wanted, if I could get everyone on the call to do one thing right now, it would be to Google Euclidean zoning. Let's see if that happens. But essentially, it's the separation of uses. It's say, let's put housing all the way over here. Let's put offices over here. And then we'll have everyone drive in between, and all of it is way not dense enough in order for people to have transit. So we're still feeling the effect. So that causes an economic entrenchment in a couple of different ways, because I also just made that term up, but it sounds really like I know what I'm talking about. So we'll go with that. But essentially what's happening is the policies are still there in a lot of ways. So we have a situation where, like you said, the zoning for Arlington is 73% still single family housing, which is not a situation that would have happened in cities before World War II. And so the policies are still there. So people that buy into those houses, say you're a single family homeowner, over time, because there is a lack of supply in the market and an increasing demand as population continues to go up, the value of your house continues to rise, and the market for housing, the supply of housing, is still artificially restricted by, and I'm gonna sound a bit like a conservative here, but that's okay. The market is artificially restricted by the government regulation that is restricting density and preserving people's what is a housing preference for some. So I hope that makes sense to everybody. I hope everyone can Google Euclidean zoning and some of the solutions that we're going to talk about. So let's go to our first question here. Do you have a comment on any of that, Matt?
Sure. Actually, I appreciate that you mentioned it. It does give the historic perspective. Euclidean zoning came shortly, 1930s and 40s.
That's correct. Yeah.
Single family zoning really came, and if we're honest about why single-family zoning came forward, it was shortly after some terrible policies, really racist policies called restrictive covenants, were deemed unconstitutional by the U.S. Supreme Court. So, if you look, Arlington for nearly 20 years was the fastest growing county in the United States from about 1943 or 4 to 1960 or so. And we put in single family and we didn't allow for row houses. And that was part of an intentional set of policies to not be as inclusive as the Arlington that we think of. So I'm really glad that you brought that history to where we were. And that's why we on the board, if we're thinking about equity, we want to be intentional about creating housing types that make us an inclusive community and not just a place where, you sit exclusively only in a single family home and say, this is my county. When in reality, we need to expand supply and allow the American dream to work in actuality for the next generations. So I'm really glad you described Euclidean zoning. And that was one of the questions that kind of came beforehand. There's 5 or 6 others, but why don't we go to Facebook and I can work in the other questions, if that's okay.
Sounds good to me. Let's see, Dan, can we get you to shoot us a Facebook question?
I should be able to get it may be in the Google Doc, I think. But
okay.
Why don't I just start and then you can tee up because I'm...
Okay. Right. Okay. Okay, so the first one that's it was at the bottom of the document. Let's see. So the first one is regarding Lion Village and Lion Park. So someone says, I'm walking around the single-family neighborhoods. I live in the Clarendon Courthouse areas. There's a lot of tear downs happening. So why should these large single-family homes be easier to build? They don't require a site plan or a lengthy approval process than similarly massed multiplexes. Is that correct? Or is there a similar process or a dissimilar process for different types of development?
There's the different zoning categories allow you by right to stay with your same single or multifamily zoning. So, for example, I knocked in Lion Village twice, about 2-3 blocks from Clarendon's Metro. I knocked on the door twice 2 years ago of an 83, because when it comes up in van, you can see the age. It was 83 or so year old woman. I said, do you love living here? And she was out gardening. And she said, yes. And then she said, the one thing is that house across the street is like 5 stories high. Well, that house was by right because it was a single family house. So this question is a great question. It is the case that single family houses are by right under Virginia law, where multiplex houses, duplexes and triplexes in many zoning categories, in many zones in Arlington, zoning classifications, it takes much more to get a multiplex, a duplex approved. I don't think that.
How burdensome is that to the housing supply issue, and when you take all things considered?
Well, it's a huge reason why our supply is not keeping up with our demand.
Okay.
And part of that reason I mentioned people now want to live in closer to Arlington. Our schools are fantastic, so people want to live here. But it's also the case that even without that change in preference, you still would have people unable to do a duplex, a triplex, unable to meet the growing population that is in the DC area. So, for example, regionally, the Council of Governments, which Arlington and DC and Alexandria and Maryland suburbs all belong to, has projected we need to build 75,000 new units over the next 30 years. And we're projected to build less than that. And every unit you build less than that, it makes it harder and harder for people to find a place that they can rent or buy here. So it's a, the question is exactly right. It's a mismatch from our policies to the real world of where we are. There's also part of that question that asks the next step, which is, will you support making small apartment buildings by right in these neighborhoods to streamline the process? And if not, why not? So some of you probably have heard about what Minneapolis did. They said that in the same size house, same size footprint of a building, you can have a triplex by right instead of a duplex. So you can fit 3 living units in that same size home or size building. So the problem, as I see it with Minneapolis for Arlington, is, and this may not be an easy thing to share, but change is hard. And there was a whole period, the way that the metros were sold, undergrounding the metros were sold to our county in the 1970s, was that we would have density around the corridors, but we would keep the neighborhoods the same. And that's the political campaigns that went into passing a huge bond, I think somewhere between 1969 and 73. And so there's some who live in single family homes who think that that was the way the world was then and it has to stay that way forever. And that is, we just know that the world doesn't stay the same. And we have to adapt and evolve and apply our Arlington values to the next generation of challenges. So in other words, I think we should change, but we need to build a consensus. And if we were, in my opinion, and there are others on the board who think differently, but in my opinion, if we have to build a community consensus that includes renters who are over 50% of our population and also homeowners, so that we can build a governing coalition, if you will.
So on that note, when you're saying building this Arlington consensus, would that have the ability to change? Would a consensus in one neighborhood be okay to change the policies in that neighborhood? Is this going to be a piecemeal approach, or do you think we're talking Arlington wide, or how would that play out?
Great question. I think it's somewhere in the middle. The way I think of it is, you can't say if you live in Crystal City that what happens in Courthouse or what happens on the Orange Line has nothing to do with you, because they're all related. And you can't say if you live, my parents live in McLean, if you can't say if you live on the Arlington side of the border that you deserve perfect schools and who cares about what happens in South Arlington. We are all linked together, but we have to respect and understand some of the differences. That's part of why I thought, we had a huge commercial vacancy rate. What we did with Amazon was pre-COVID, but it will help address some of that commercial vacancy rate, and that means resources that we can put into affordable housing and into our schools. So I think if you think of the corridors, the way I think of what might be good policy, and we're still working on it. We're all working on it, and this is just my vision, is bubbles out, sort of, if you think of the Michelin Man, like bubbles out from the corridor where there would need to be increased density. And right. We also would have to get everybody to think and care about this together, because, to do this, we're going to have differences in certain communities, but we all need to engage in the change that is going to help us be a better community.
Right. And so on that, on a different note, you were mentioning earlier about a regional perspective and some policies in different states. To what extent could a state level policy be helpful for increasing the housing supply in Arlington, and especially with this missing middle housing problem? I'm sure you're aware that the state legislature had a bill about increasing the minimum floor for density within municipalities to duplexes instead of single family housing.
Yeah, so I mean, that's a great question, and I believe it was Delegate Ibrahim Salim's bill that put this forward, and my trouble with the bill is that, well, first it didn't get very much support within even the Democratic Party that you and I worked hard to help elect. It didn't have broad support, and I thought it would. There are so many issues upon which we must make a difference that I thought
Right.
the kickback would be so negative by so many people, even many Democrats, and I thought it was too broad of a tool. It not only didn't have very,
Sure.
it just, but it was. I'm not saying it's, of course, his right to bring it forward. What we did do this year is we gave counties like Arlington the authority to tax in some ways, like the plastic bag tax, and we gave, those are other authorities that counties and municipalities, counties didn't have as much, and so I just thought it was too broad a tool.
Certainly. And just for context for people, so the reason that state level issues or state level bills can sometimes help local politicians is because it takes that issue and that political hot potato out of their hands. And it could be something that there's not a consensus around, but is just generally good policy. But in this case, there just wasn't broad enough political support. Would you say that's accurate?
Yeah, thanks. Really appreciate you providing that context as I go deep into
it's sort of a similar issue to why schools still, especially in some places like Richmond, still struggle. This is totally a hot potato. Sometimes schools won't integrate just because local politicians, all of their voters are about the status quo. So if you are elected to office and then you change everyone's school boundaries, you're going to immediately lose not immediately, but you will lose your job as a politician. So the state level policies can be very effective in helping remove that political barrier. So that's where I was going with that. So another question about Arlington, there are in some areas form-based codes. Now, form-based codes are very useful, especially for creating a transition from from dense areas to single-family homes. So a form-based code for everyone. This is another thing you should Google. It's kind of like the anti-Euclidean zoning. It's essentially what it takes, instead of taking an approach to what type of housing you can build and what it can be shaped like, it gives you a building envelope, which is just what you can build within a lot. And so that building envelope can be just generally sloped in the same way that the missing middle housing is sloped from dense to not dense. And it sort of takes a lot of the specific regulations off of housing, but allows for a continuous built environment that makes more sense. Does that make sense?
That's great. That's helpful context. I think the question was about what if we tried to do form-based code more broadly. Right now, there's a form-based code in along Columbia Pike that is being used steadily to help redevelop the Pike, but done in a way that really the civic associations along the Pike supported when it was passed, I think some 8 or 10 years back now. And I think it's a good tool. I don't know if, there's discussion about the Lee Highway corridor and what to do there. I'm not sure that a form-based code applied county-wide is necessarily the solution that I think is a good one. Underneath all of this is a debate about change and development and density. And that was one of the other questions. And what I argued when I ran for the board was that we won't stay the same, but how we grow matters. And we have to be aware of the density concerns, but also evolve to meet the new needs that we face as a county. So, there are well-meaning individuals who I think could be on either side of just develop without thinking about how we're developing enough, And then there are those who say we should really stay exactly as we are. And, that's the question about how dense do we want our population to be? And I think that's one way of asking the question, but another is how do we best serve the growing needs of our community? And some of those needs are stormwater response. We saw in the July 8th flooding this past year. And some of those are having enough schools, school capacity, but also we've talked about housing supply. So as you're thinking about this whole conversation, part of it is how we grow matters and how dense do we want to be, how quickly, and how much do we need to meet investments in schools and stormwater.
Certainly. That is a great segue into our question that's more community focused. Of course, with any topic about housing, you will inevitably get a question about gentrification. Just so everyone is on the same page, gentrification is a term that refers to the character of a neighborhood changing, usually in an upward class direction. Displacement is when people that exist in the neighborhood are forced out either through economic conditions such as higher rent costs or because their older, more affordable units are being replaced. Do those definitions sit well with you, Matt? Okay. So what is the community-based approach to this? How are we going to keep our populations, especially disadvantaged people, from being
Displaced. Yeah,
displaced. Exactly. So,
sure. So it's a good question. It's not an easy one. Some on the call will know the county names for market rate affordable units. They're called MARCs. And the public type housing, we don't have public housing. We have a number of nonprofits who help develop housing and some for-profit who help develop housing that are called, these are your public housing that you may have been aware of wherever you grew up, if not in Arlington. Those are called CAFs, Committed Affordable Units. Market rate units are MARCs, Committed Affordable Units are CAFs. The number of market rate affordable units over the last 15, 18 years went from well over 10,000, I think about 15 or 16,000, down to 2,000. And that is the numeric story of how many parts of the county, including and perhaps especially Columbia Pike, redeveloped. People redid the apartment buildings and charged more for the new units that were nicer on the inside. But they also charged more because people were tired of driving 2 hours to get out to Ashburn. So there's a lot of gentrification that is happening across the county, and it certainly has happened along the Roslyn-Ballston corridor. But I think it's very important to think about gentrification and displacement as distinct. We don't want to keep neighborhoods that are low income. We don't want them to stay low income, but we want people to be able to afford a place to live. So, for example, in Roslyn, there's a new building that is going up behind the new HB school, HB Woodlawn, that the APA is putting together, the Arlington Partnership for Affordable Housing, and they're building it, and I can see it go up. It's going from about 45 units to 249 units. And that development helps so many more people afford to live in Arlington. And because the income bands for that set of units is more affordable, 60 to 80% of area median income. And keep in mind that the median income for an individual in Arlington is, for one person in a household, is about $80,000. And for an entire household is $120,000. So these units, there's a whole lot more units that are affordable And in some places, we've added density. We keep the lower income units, but pay for the rebuilding of those lower income units with more market rate units. So in many instances, but not all, you have more limited displacement, but you have a whole lot more neighbors. And that has some costs with it. And what the board focuses on is making sure whenever there's a development, we ask for as much as we can from developers to help us invest in those CAFs and committed affordable units that we are building to replace what the market is not providing. So that's pretty weedy, but I hope that that's relevant to what so many of us on the board are worried about. And we put $500,000 last year at the closing of the budget into Thrive because we were worried about displacement that could have resulted from Amazon as it goes up towards Columbia Pike and the rest of the county. So we're worried about displacement, and we're also concerned about gentrification, but we recognize that, if you just keep an apartment unit the same over 50, 60 years, it eventually becomes uninhabitable. So you have to rebuild it in order to keep that preserve, it's called, but it's really rebuilding a unit to preserve the affordable housing. So that's a lot. I hope that's at least helpful.
Yeah, lots of information there. Let's see. Let's take a Facebook question. So, I mean, there are also proposals that are essentially you have a metro station, draw a quarter-mile area around it. What is your take on? And I'm going to guess your answer is going to be we don't want a hard and fast rule everywhere. But what is your take on upzoning areas as a direct result, as like a formulaic result to transit stations?
Well, I mean, I don't love the phrase upzoning because there's some in Arlington who have used that phrase as a kind of a cudgel, I would say, to some who are opponents of the evolution that I think we need to go through. But in answer to your question, I'm a little less ambivalent than you might think in terms of very close to a metro station, we should not be having, we should really be thinking about those as areas where we should allow density if we can. Sure. And, California, I think but many will know that California had this huge debate about this. And, there are lots of different ways to think about this, but it cannot be not in my neighborhood. It has to be that I have to live we all have to live together, and we need to be safe, but Arlington is a very safe community. And so within a quarter mile of metro, I would lean pretty strongly towards saying we need to think of ways that the missing middle can lead to solutions that allow for more density. Because we just can't have a community where we say, oh, I'd love to have moderate income and low income folks, but not in my part of the county. That's just not going to get us to the community we want.
Right, and relaxing zoning, as a nicer way to put that, relaxing zoning is not the only way that you can add density to a neighborhood. For example, one of the leading causes of low density housing or leading barriers to density is simply parking minimums because it takes up space by a unit. So for example, if you're trying to build 3 units, you have to build 3.5 parking spaces or whatever the formula is. There's simply not enough space on the lot to accommodate some of the regulations. So parking and a number of other regulations such as setbacks, things of that nature can also allow for more density without using the upzoning term. So let's take one more question. Matt, does anything on this question list give you the last pick?
Well, I think you actually touched on the one that I don't think that we had talked about, and that is
Okay.
parking minimums and garage requirements. You may know this, others might who are watching. A year and a half, maybe 2 years ago, we did a huge discussion of parking. And, some people see the space in front of their single-family home yard as their property. But of course, it actually is it's on the public right-of-way. It's on the county's shared space. And so I think that parking and garage minimums, we are a transit-oriented community that has seen the huge benefits of mixed use. And those two types of solutions you identified are part of the answers. What I don't love is, that conversation 2.5 years ago, I thought we were going to be able to figure out a lot of what to do on the budget, but the parking was killing us. And I just think that if you frame these conversations in a sense of respect for private property and understanding that the values of so many Arlingtonians' single-family homes are $300,000 more than they ever dreamed that they would be worth. If you frame it as we also are all in this together, then I think you get to a good place. And maybe that's a good note to end on, because for all of you who are out there, I think it's important just to remember that even though we have a phenomenal AYD team that is, I'd put up against any party I've ever seen in the country, and this is a recovering Iowan who got to see that, the Iowa caucuses. Even if you're at home alone, we are together, and all those challenges that you're feeling when you would prefer to be having a drink on a Tuesday or Thursday, let's remember that it's a tough time, but we will get back to missing middle, and we will get back to all that makes Arlington a phenomenal place to live.
Right. I've treated this advocacy as a healthy distraction from what's going on in our world these days. Matt, thanks so much for taking the time to speak with us today. This is very informative. If anyone has any particular questions, please reach out to me, the Infrastructure and Development Caucus Chair for Arlington Young Dems. Matt, thanks again. And if you have any last comments, we had one last question that was something along the lines of what makes you want to be a community advocate, and what gives you the passion for public service. And I'll let you leave with that.
It's very kind. I guess, I think you revealed yourself to be plenty the urban planning nerd. No disrespect, but
no disrespect.
Yeah, so I guess, both your questions, Ethan, but also whoever wrote that question is what I've been thinking of the last really 3 to 5 days, but it's been true every day that I've gotten to serve on the county board, which is I just want to be as good an advocate for everyone who's here as the people I've actually met in Arlington. Because I've met people are smart and good and kind. And, that's just doing as right as all of you and AYD. You guys traipsed everywhere for Sheila's race all over the state. And because of what you did, we get to have a county that can pass things like common sense gun safety. But it's really just trying to be as good as you guys and everyone else that I've met in the county that makes it an easy job that's really an honor. So thanks.
All right. Great, Matt. Thanks so much.
Thank you. Have a good evening.
All right. See ya.